Hey, it's Jason Markusoff filling in for Jamie. Last Thursday, a massive wave of people arrived on the shores of Ceuta, a tiny Spanish enclave in North Africa. The 72,000 migrants came from neighboring Morocco, spurred by a flurry of online rumors. According to Spanish media, around 142 of them died at the border, mostly from drowning or trampling. And if it was a wave coming in, it receded just as fast. In about 48 hours, most of the migrants left, largely on their own accord. But what's lingered is a political crisis for the pro-immigration Spanish government in an increasingly anti-immigration European Union that's focused on border security. And there are questions surrounding how exactly this came to be and who's to blame. Aitor Hernandez Morales is based in Brussels, Belgium, and has been covering the political fallout over the last week for Politico. He's also reported for many years in Spain. Aitor, it's great to have you back.
Lovely to be with you.
So Aitor, as I mentioned in the intro, the vast majority of migrants that came to Ceuta from Morocco left very soon after. But as of Wednesday afternoon, a couple thousand are still there, I understand. A lot of them are kids. Can you tell me what's happening with them right now and how people are doing in Ceuta?
Yeah, so obviously for the city of Ceuta, which has 80,000 inhabitants, the past few days have been very chaotic. In total, what we're hearing from the Spanish government is that 72,000 people made it across the border. So, it was an amount of people that was almost the size of the normal population of this exclave on the northern coast of Africa. While, as you mentioned, the vast majority of them have returned, the Spanish government has very clear laws with minors. They are now to be redistributed to different Spanish regions on the mainland, and there they will be put into centers where they can be taken care of, and where they will, receive the attentions that the EU normally affords to unaccompanied minors. In terms of how the exclave continues to live through this situation, it's obviously very uncomfortable for people who live in the city. It's not just the disturbances that were caused by so many people coming in, but also the fact that when we talk about these over 1,000 people that are left, they are sleeping in squares, they're sleeping on the beach. It is a crisis situation and a humanitarian situation, which for the moment is unresolved.
So paint me a picture of how this happened. Let's clarify that this is in Africa. This is
Yes.
across the Strait of Gibraltar, not mainland Europe.
Yeah.
But that's, 72,000 people. That's a lot. How did this happen?
So it happened first as a trickle and then a torrent. What we began to detect were small clusters of young men swimming across the beachhead that separates the Moroccan coastline from the Spanish coastline. So the main city that was affected was Ceuta. We also had some incidences in Melilla. And just for your listeners to get a clear idea about this, these are two Spanish fortified cities on the northern coast of Africa. So on one side, they have the Mediterranean Sea, and behind them, they have Morocco. These are Spanish possessions that have existed and have been ruled by Spain for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. And these are cities that have always had their own status within the Spanish state. And that in modern day Spain, so in democratic Spain, constitutionally, they have the same status as any other Spanish region. They have their representation in the Spanish parliament. So, going back to your question, what happened on Thursday is that it began with these small groups of men who were swimming around the border and coming in to the Tarafal beach in Ceuta. And then gradually, this number began to ramp up and ramp up over the course of the day until it just became this human tsunami in a lot of ways.
Through the floating debris left behind by hours of chaos and frenzy, still more people came to Ceuta today, landing on Spanish territory, having skirted round the headland from Morocco. More surges by land too, adding to the tens of thousands of people who've breached this border with mainland Africa since just yesterday.
The first question that was asked is how is this possible? And it seems that what really triggered it was one, a series of rumors that began to circulate online in Morocco, and then additionally, the disappearance of the Moroccan border guards that are normally there to stop people from crossing over. So, with the incredible amount of people that were coming over, Spanish border guards were very quickly overwhelmed and were basically unable to stop folks from coming through.
And were these mostly Moroccans or people from elsewhere in Africa?
We're still trying to get a clearer picture, but the overwhelming impression, because obviously they weren't checking people's documents once they decided to return, is that they are Moroccans, and that of the people who have remained, so that small number that I mentioned at the beginning, those either they are minors, some of whom are Moroccan, or they are adult sub-Saharan Africans who don't really have anywhere else to go back to.
I understand there was a bunch of false rumors on or misleading rumors online that were propelling that. What can you tell me about those?
Yeah, so it's a pretty interesting situation. We have heard that on social media channels that are frequented or followed in Morocco, this message began to circulate saying that Spanish authorities had relaxed the rules and that as long as you crossed in from the sea, you would be allowed to stay. We've also heard that, in some of these messages, they even implied that if you crossed over, Spanish authorities would give them money. So it seems like that definitely generated a lot of interest. It is generally accepted that this situation could not have expanded to the extent that it did without some kind of complicity on the part of the Moroccan government. And what I mean by that is that when we had a previous incident with similar characteristics back in 2021, when 8,000 unauthorized migrants crossed over.
Footage from local Faro TV channel showed soldiers in armoured vehicles rushing to the beach as hundreds of potential migrants stood on the Moroccan side of the fence. Reuters journalists saw Red Cross workers helping migrants laying on the floor. At least one person died in the crossing, according to a local government spokesperson.
We had a lot of these very similar characteristics. The border guards vanished. These people crossed over.
So I guess that those investigations and the truth about what happened here will come out over time. But I think what's amazing about this is as fast as these 72,000 people came, 70,000 or so of them left.
Indeed.
Was that on their own accord or what happened there?
So what we saw very quickly is that Ceuta seems to have its own way of dealing with these crisis situations, and basically the local population, when they see that this is happening, they go into self-imposed lockdown. They close their shops, they sequester themselves in their homes, and so it seems like a lot of the migrants crossed over and then immediately realized that first and foremost they could not get across to the Spanish mainland. That's because even though Ceuta belongs to the Schengen zone, which is this free travel zone that includes 29 countries in Europe, the Spanish exclaves have an exception to that rule, which is that to cross over to mainland Spain and therefore to continental Europe, documentation has to be provided. These people did not have documents, therefore they had no way of getting on the ferries that connect Ceuta to mainland Europe. And then separately, they're stranded in the city. All the shops are closed. They have no place to sleep. We're talking about summer in northern Africa, so it's very, very warm. They have no way of getting food or water. A lot of these people, it seems, very quickly came to the conclusion that there was no point to their being there. And again, this is why authorities think that the majority of them were probably Moroccan. They very quickly came to the conclusion they were better off just crossing back across the border and going home. And on Friday, the numbers that we got from the Spanish government were that by midday, people were returning back across the border at a rate of 125 people per minute. So it really gives you an idea of just how quickly first people came in and then left.
Before we get into some of the interconnected relations between Spain and Morocco, let's talk about the rest of Europe, which also saw this as a real provocation and a problem. Spain seems like it's been a bit of an outlier in the European Union with its more progressive approach to migration, and we saw kind of the pointy edge of that this week with 22 of 27 EU leaders, including German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, signing this open letter taking aim at the migration policies. How would you characterize the reaction from Europe initially?
It was a really interesting situation because the reaction was certainly spearheaded by Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who is on the far right and has championed very severe migration policies. And when the first images came out of Spain on Thursday, she immediately came out to say that Spain had lost control of the border, and she attributed the surge of migrants into Ceuta to the Spanish government's efforts to grant legal status to what it appears is going to be 1.2 million undocumented migrants living in Spain. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that we're talking about two totally unrelated issues. So the legal status scheme rolled out by the Spanish government this year was presented in February, and it was only available for people who had already been living in Spain and had been living in Spain for at least 5 months prior to the beginning of 2026. And the idea with this scheme was that Sanchez, the Spanish prime minister, was acknowledging that Spain, like the rest of Europe, is undergoing demographic collapse.
Spain offered immigrants the limited chance to become fully integrated tax-paying residents. 1 million people who were previously living in the country without authorisation were on the path toward getting work and residency permits. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is very much a progressive leader. He called the measure an act of justice and necessity, arguing that people already living and working in Spain should do so under equal conditions and pay taxes.
And so the idea was to create these conditions so that those people could get their papers in order and be able to fully contribute to the tax system, essentially to recognize the reality of so many people already living in Spain. Now, the deadline to apply to that process was in June. And what the Spanish government insisted from the beginning was that this is completely unrelated to Ceuta. None of the people who came into Ceuta could have possibly benefited from this scheme. None of the people who came into Ceuta had any right to remain in Spain. Despite that being very clear legally, a lot of European governments chose to ignore it and chose to use the situation in Ceuta to attack the Spanish government and to claim that the Spanish government had essentially brought this crisis on itself and on the rest of Europe, and to really raise this alarm, saying that the people who had come into Ceuta would now be able to stay because of Spain's tolerant policies and that they would soon trickle into the rest of Europe. And so on Friday, for example, Italy suspended the application of the Schengen agreement with Spain. So it started demanding passports and visas from all travelers arriving from Spain to Italy on planes or by boats. And very quickly, we saw, for example, the Finnish interior minister, who also belongs to a nationalist party. She came out and attacked the Spanish government and said that it had caused this. You saw even suggestions from friendly prime ministers, like the Prime Minister of Sweden and Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, who is a social democrat who belongs to Sanchez's own center-left European social democratic grouping. Even she was taking pop shots at Spain and saying that Spain needed to take control of its affairs and that this situation was unacceptable.
Were these, do you think, like legitimate diplomatic concerns, or are these politicians playing to their own domestic audiences in criticizing Spain?
It very much feels like it is the latter, that these were politicians who were playing to their home audience. In Meloni's case, she was clearly playing to the conservative voters in Italy. What I would say is that more broadly, when we look at figures like Merz in Germany or the Swedish Prime Minister, in that case, it was a reaction to the situation. And I think panic because migration is such an explosive issue in Europe, and because so many Europeans have ultimately come to the conclusion that Europe suffered during the 2015 migration crisis. I think a lot of them scrambled to essentially say, we're not part of this. We actually are protecting our borders. We're not soft on migration. So it was very much an electoral reaction.
This week, after this happens, the EU holds this extraordinary meeting of its ambassadors. Then on Tuesday, its interior ministers. I've seen it described as this overdue show of solidarity. What came out of it?
Yeah, it was a really fascinating situation because as you mentioned, 22 EU leaders signed on to this letter on Saturday, in which they suggested that Spain's migration policies may have caused this, and they demanded to have a meeting of EU ambassadors on Monday and interior ministers on Tuesday. And it does seem that by the time everyone was facing one another, then their tone changed very quickly because, on the face of it, the facts out of Spain were relatively clear. It was evident that the Spanish policies had nothing to do with this very, very specific situation. And Spain very much showed up in a aggressively defensive manner, using data to show that actually, Spain has fewer incidences of unauthorized entrances than, for example, Italy. Both the ministers and the ambassadors who attended these meetings ultimately switched course very quickly and instead adopted a tone of solidarity with Spain and one of broad support for reinforcing the bloc's borders. So, to your question, what is really interesting about these meetings and about this situation is that the conversation about migration in Europe has clearly shifted dramatically to the right, to the point where this situation, even if ambassadors now recognize that Spain was not at fault and that Madrid handled the situation as best it could, the overwhelming conclusion from this, from everyone, including progressives, has been Europe needs to beef up its borders, and that migration is essentially a threat to Europe.
So, for all this pointing fingers by European leaders at Spain, a lot of politicians in Spain are blaming Morocco. Can you help me understand why would Morocco, if it's true that they were orchestrating or behind it, why would they do that?
So Morocco and Spain have a complicated relationship in a lot of ways. Ultimately, Morocco has realized that with Spain, there is a very easy way of exerting political pressure through these kinds of situations. And as I mentioned before, in 2021, we saw a clear example of that, where Morocco retired its border guards and allowed 8,000 unauthorized migrants to stream into Ceuta to put the Spanish prime minister in an uncomfortable situation. So let's get into that whole debate. Spain, during the early half of the 20th century, had possessions in Morocco that included the Spanish Sahara province. This province was taken essentially forcibly by Morocco in 1975 when Spanish dictator Francisco Franco lay dying. They orchestrated a mass movement of people into this province and essentially forced the Spaniards to retire. The issue is that province has never been, or that territory now, which is known as Western Sahara, has never been fully incorporated into the Moroccan state. Morocco claims it as its own, but both the UN and Spain and the wider European Union have always had the stance that Western Sahara should have the right to have a self-determination referendum to decide whether it joins Morocco or whether it becomes an independent state. This situation has been frozen for decades. And in 2021, Spain allowed the president of the independent part of this territory of Western Sahara to come to Spain to receive medical treatment because he had a chronic illness. This upset the Moroccans a lot. And so a few weeks after this happened, that's when this incident took place where they retired the border guards and let these people through. And it was widely read as Morocco showing that it was unhappy with the Spanish government and essentially telling the prime minister, I know that when we do this, this puts you in a very uncomfortable situation. and we can keep doing this as many times as we need to make you bow to our position. It was very effective because within a year, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez reversed Spain's historic position on Western Sahara and announced that Madrid now considered Morocco should be running this territory.
So, was there something that may have directly provoked this in summer 2026?
Yeah, so the suspicion is that this all has to do with Spain restoring ties with Algeria, a country that is Morocco's regional rival. So Algeria supports the independence of Western Sahara. And when Spain recognized Morocco's claim to the territory in 2022, ties between Algiers and Madrid suffered greatly. And Algeria almost cut off relations completely with Spain. Prime Minister Sanchez has been working very hard to restore those relations. And earlier this month, or rather last month, he traveled to Algiers to sign a treaty of friendship with the Algerians, restoring commercial ties and actually committing Algeria to sell more natural gas to Spain. The suspicion is that the Moroccans were very upset by this and that this latest move was undertaken to show that they are very unhappy with Spain.
And don't mean to further complicate things, but does Morocco's closer alignment with the Trump administration add to the tension here at all?
Things have been very weird this year. It is absolutely true that at the same time that relations between Madrid and Washington have grown worse because of the ongoing tensions between Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, who is a progressive, and the Trump administration, notably for Sanchez's opposition to the war in Iran. Relations between Washington and Rabat are exceptional. And that's in part due to a 2020 deal in which Trump accepted recognizing Morocco's claims to Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, which was a major goal of the Trump administration as part of the wider Abraham Accords and the administration's move to improve Israel's relationship with neighbors in that entire part of the world. What we have seen more recently is figures associated with the MAGA movement have begun amplifying Morocco's claims to Spain's autonomous cities. Earlier this year, a congressional report authored by a prominent Republican congressman included language recognizing that Morocco had a territorial claim to Ceuta and Melilla. And then simultaneously, you've also seen that backed up by figures like Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, who reacted to the crisis in Ceuta by questioning why Spain, had allegedly had a colony still in northern Africa. So very much using these terms that are aligned with Morocco's territorial claims over the Spanish territory. So it's absolutely uncomfortable for the Sanchez administration. And it is a reminder that diplomacy is very important, even with people who you don't necessarily agree with.
And Donald Trump has weighed in on this. What happened in Ceuta? He called it a quote invasion and saying that quote the same
thing's going to happen to us if the Republicans don't get elected, except worse.
I mean, this imagery of thousands upon thousands of foreigners entering European territory all at once, it seems tailor-made for populist ads and memes in Europe and North America. What do you foresee this becoming in the greater immigration debate in the West?
I think certainly in Europe, this is going to be a talking point for the foreseeable future. And I think it is going to lead to a lot of contradictory conversations. If you speak to any European leader, they will recognize that, again, demographically, the continent isn't doing well. It is a rapidly aging continent, and it desperately needs people to be economically competitive. There's no way around it, and this is in the reports that we get from the European Commission, this is made abundantly clear, and yet there is very much this narrative of foreign invasion, of people coming in, of changing our quote unquote European values. So the images from Ceuta are visually a disaster in a lot of ways because they're so shocking, they're so disturbing for a lot of people that I think it is going to make it all the more difficult to carry out what would be common sense migration policies. Unfortunately, because of the Ceuta crisis, I don't think we're going to see such ambitious migration policies in Spain in the near future, and probably in the rest of Europe, because a lot of people will, on the right and on the far right, will argue, gosh, if you pass this, then are you going to end up actually pulling in unauthorized migrants? Are we going to have a Ceuta situation?
We spent a lot of time on what the reaction has been to this, but, it's this time of massive global instability and conflict. What is this going to mean for people like the ones who are stranded on that beach in Ceuta right now, and others who could find themselves displaced and needing to find safety or a better home?
I think, a week after this crisis situation occurred, it's really important to take a moment to look past the politics of it and really look at the humanitarian aspect. These are people who are being used as chess pieces in a geopolitical game, and these are human beings. So it is a really horrific situation. We don't know still the exact details of how they were persuaded to cross over, but ultimately these are people, especially the ones who have stayed, who are in a desperate situation and who are sitting there in a beach on the North African coast, waiting to see what happens with them. It's worth keeping in mind that nobody does this if they're not in a desperate situation. Nobody voluntarily jumps into the ocean and tries to swim to a beach with the hope of at some point making it to Europe just because they want better conditions. These are people who are in very desperate situations back home.
Aitor, thank you so much for explaining this all to us.
Always a pleasure.
That's all for today. I'm Jason Markusoff. Thank you so much for listening.